What did Victorians do for fun, and what did their book collections look like? There are several Victorian connections at Walt Disney World, from the storytelling and theming of the Haunted Mansion to the Grand Floridian, which is a Victorian-themed resort. I thought it would be fun to explore vintage books worthy of Madame Leota's library and learn about the activities the ghostly guests in the mansion might pursue in their free time. It's also Victober, which is a readathon hosted by three of my favorite booktubers, Kate Howe, Katie from Books and Things, and Lucy the Reader. And a couple of books on my Boo To You TBR crossover perfectly with Victober. Now let's begin the video. I am so excited to share with you today my mom's Victorian and Edwardian vintage book collection. I haven't looked through any of these books before, only the covers. The only one is one called 50 Social Evenings, which I'm so excited to share with you because it's an actual Victorian book from the 1890s that has lots of ideas for social evenings and parties, and it gives us a little insight into what they did for fun. Some of the ideas are really kind of cool and things that we might do today, and some of them are so strange and something that we would never do today because of technology or just because it would seem kind of mundane or odd. But before we get into the books, I just had to talk about my Victorian inspired outfit. This brooch is my great-grandmother's from England. This bow is not vintage. The actual look of it was inspired by my American great-grandmother, and I will pop a picture of her right here. She's wearing her bow a little bit lower down with it looks like maybe a loose bun. And then I had to show you this picture. This was taken during the Victorian era when she was 14. She had a bunch of photos taken and a pen was made, and this is the picture of her. Let's get into the most important part that you came here to see, which is the vintage Victorian and Edwardian books. The very first book that I wanted to show you is a vintage edition of Lorna Doone. This was written in the 1860s, but this edition was given to someone in 1904. It says compliments of Mr. and Mrs. Willis Dobson, July 26, 1904. So I think that's when it was published. It doesn't have a copyright date on it. I have been wanting to read this book for a very long time. It sounds like an interesting Romeo and Juliet sort of story about warring clans in the 17th century. So here's the cover. It says in the preface, this work is called a romance because the incidents, characters, time, and scenery are alike romantic. While looking through Victober vlogs, I have seen several people have read it and love this story, so I definitely am going to have to get an Oxford edition of it. I've always been too scared to pull this one down and read it because the pages are very fragile, so I want to get a new version of this and read the story soon. I wanted to show you the book I'm most excited about, which is 50 Social Evenings. It's by Anne E. Smiley, and it says the League at Work series. So I actually tried to research this and I could not find that much about it at all. I would love to know more about who created these books, if these were popular, but I wanted to read one of the more unusual ones to you. It's called A Nutting Party, and it says, this, if rightly managed, will give an evening of rare fun and will effectually break up any feeling of constraint or timidity among the young people. It is well to have a new barn or unfurnished house in which to hold the social, as it is a little boisterous for a private home or a league room. A peck or more of peanuts are to be hidden in different places about the room where they may be easily reached. When the members of the nutting party arrive, each person is supplied with a small 5-cent market basket, and at the given signal, they start around the room filling their baskets as they find the nuts. I actually think that sounds really fun. It's kind of a scavenger hunt. Even though I wouldn't go back in time to a lot of things in the Victorian era, I think it's kind of cool that they had to entertain themselves without anything. Like, they actually had to use their imagination. I almost want to have a Victorian party and try a bunch of these. Wouldn't that be so much fun, where everybody dressed up in Victorian clothes and tried some of these games? This one is called Historic Characters and Impersonations. Each person on entering the room is labeled with a name pinned on the back, and without knowing who he is, goes about talking with the people and attempting to discover his own identity, which I think is a fun party game that a lot of people play now, actually, because I've played this at a party. And I think there's maybe even an app where people play this game now, where I think that you put the phone on your head. I think I've played that version of it too. But you're supposed to be someone famous. But this one says, someone may perhaps be marked as Tsar of Russia, and he is much puzzled when people ask him anxiously if his life is not in peril, and if the weather isn't pretty cold where he lives, and it is some time before he really finds himself out. Queen Victoria is puzzled when she is asked if her eldest son hasn't been something of a trial to her, and whether it is true that she doesn't have a new bonnet very often. So I've been kind of flipping through this book, and one that sounds really fun to me is called Tourist Social. And it says, sometimes this takes the form of an imaginary journey, and everyone is invited beforehand to come prepared with timetables, most direct routes, but in these days of running to and fro, you are pretty sure to think of someone who has been to Washington, another who has visited Niagara Falls. Probably there will be one or more who has traveled to Alaska, Europe, or the East. All these people may be invited to give a short account of where they went, what they saw, and the difficulties and dangers they conquered. A small table may be set apart for the souvenirs and curiosities which have been gathered in travel. So I think that's so fun. Imagine having all of your friends over. Instead of just seeing their travels on Instagram or YouTube, you would actually have everybody come over and bring their souvenirs and lay them out on tables and talk to you about the perils of their trip, and imagine what it would be like to go there someday.
There's so many interesting things in this book that I just wanted to take a couple of seconds to really look through it further. You can see the penciled in inscription here. It says 1895. And here's a look at the contents of some of the different parties and social evening ideas. There's the second page. There's an evening about uncompleted quotations. Someone begins a rather long prose extract or poem and recites one or two lines. Someone else continues until he forgets or misquotes, which I think is really funny to think about, because how often do any of us memorize poems today? And people are just expected to know various poems such that they could keep them going and complete the whole poem for a party. Here's one called Living Rulers, and it's about rulers in different countries. Flower Social. This would naturally come in the summer when flowers are abundant. It says, after offering the flowers, ice cream and cake may be served, and it will make it especially dainty if a tiny bunch of flowers is laid on each folded paper napkin as the plates are passed. The flowers should be sent to the sick or aged people of the place, or to some flower mission, hospital, or prison. Oh, that's really kind of sweet. This entertainment is best suited to a small circle or a home party. All the visitors are supplied with small plates, each containing a large apple and a fruit knife. The contest is now to see which shall be able to cut the longest unbroken apple paring. I don't think we would find that very amusing today. Oh, there's a corn festival. A lot of these are great for fall. And it says, so these conversation socials, we want to select hot topics that everybody will be interested in. Here's a Feast of All Nations. It looks like it is about trying different foods from different cultures.
This book is called The Peterkin Papers. It's one I've never heard of before. It's got a really cool cover here. Originally it was published in 1886, but it does have another copyright of 1924. So this is a later edition, but it is a Victorian book. It has a beautiful picture inside. See right there. And I think that's supposed to be the Peterkin family. So when I did a little research, it said The Peterkin Papers is a novel-sized collection of short stories about the Peterkin family. It sounds like it's one of those books that has a lot of entertaining and funny stories. It sounds like the Peterkin family, they're a little bit silly. They have a lot of misadventures. And it's by an American author, Lucretia P. Hale. The first story is called The Lady Who Put Salt in Her Coffee. This was Mrs. Peterkin. It was a mistake. She had poured out a delicious cup of coffee, and just as she was helping herself to cream, she found she had put in salt instead of sugar. Okay, I can already tell. I think I'm gonna have to get this book out. I love this kind of sarcastic, dry humor. So the next book is perfect for October because it is about the Salem witch trials, and I'm not sure how to pronounce it, so I'm been pronouncing it Dulcibel, and it's a Victorian novel. There are several books in this collection that I couldn't find much about online. Most of what I found out was on Goodreads because people had read it and said something about the book, whether they had a vintage version themselves or they read it on Project Gutenberg. But like I said, this one is about the Salem witch trials in the 1600s. In the afternoon of a sunny autumn day, nearly 200 years ago, a young man was walking along one of the newly opened roads which led into Salem Village, or what is now called Danvers Center in the then province of Massachusetts Bay. But I find it interesting too because I also found out that Elizabeth Gaskell wrote a short novella about the Salem witch trials. So I guess maybe in the Victorian era, at least a couple of authors were really interested in examining this time period and what exactly happened. This book is called Little Prudy's Captain Horace by Sophie May. You can see here the cover, it's gorgeous. And this one is a children's book, and I did find a little bit about this one online. It was a series. This one was published in 1864, so definitely a Victorian book. I could not find a copyright date in this edition, so I'm not sure if it was from 1864 or if it's a later edition. And from what I've read, Sophie May was one of the first authors to write children realistically and with humor, so kind of interesting. I hadn't heard of her before. Grace and Horace Clifford lived in Indiana and so were called Hoosiers. Their home with its charming grounds was a little way out of town, and from the front windows of the house you could look out of the broad Ohio, a river which would be very beautiful if its yellow waters were only once settled. Here is another children's book, and I couldn't find out that much about it. It has another gorgeous, gorgeous cover. But the thing that's really interesting about this cover is that Bad Little Hannah is 8 years old, and the woman on this cover definitely looks about like 19 or 20, and I guess that they did quite a few editions like that, so I'm really not sure why. I, again, could not find out that much about it. I guess it is about a precocious 8-year-old who gets herself into lots of scrapes and lots of trouble. There's not a copyright in this edition, and from what I found on Goodreads, because I couldn't find that much about it, it was written in the 1890s, so I'm thinking maybe this edition might be that old, but either way, I think it's one of my favorite covers just because it's so pretty. It was the youngest who gave all the trouble. She was only 8 years old and was still, to all intents and purposes, a nursery child. Nevertheless, she managed to keep the family in hot water from morning until night. Her name was Hannah, and she was decidedly plain. No one could imagine why it was in her power to direct the entire house, but such was a fact. Now this book, The Enchanted Hat, is definitely an Edwardian book. It was written and published in 1908, and I think this edition is from around then, but it has a gorgeous, gorgeous cover, shows a little bit of the style of that era. This is actually a collection of stories instead of a novel, and it said when I was reading about it online that the stories are about whimsy and romance. So Harold McGrath, someone said on Goodreads, is a lot like an American P.G. Wodehouse as far as his sense of humor and the way that he writes his stories. He also wrote for Saturday Evening Post. The first story is The Enchanted Hat. Old owls say that a man cannot eat when he is in love. He can if he is mad at the way that the object of his affections has treated him, and I was mad. To be sure, I cannot recall what my order was, but the amount of the waiter's check is still vivid in my recollection. That's really fun. A man cannot eat when he's in love, but he can eat when he's mad and in love. This is another Edwardian book that was published in 1913, and it really looks like a lot of fun. I would love to read this one at some point. Let me show you the cover. It's by J. Hartley Manners, and he had a really interesting career when I looked him up. It seems as if this was also a play, so I'm not sure if the play came first or the novel came first. It seems as if a lot of his work was adapted for Hollywood films, and Douglas Fairbanks starred in one of them that was adapted from one of his short stories, and I think that maybe he might have adapted some of his stories himself as a screenwriter. I was a little unclear on that when I was looking it up, but either way it seems pretty interesting. So on Goodreads, the story was described as an Irish My Fair Lady, and the author was a British author of Irish descent, and the story sounds really interesting. It's definitely something that I would love. I do love a My Fair Lady story, but it's about Salt of the Earth Peg, who was born of an Irish father and a British mother. The British mother was part of the aristocracy. She ran away. She was disowned by her family for marrying an Irishman, and so Peg grew up very differently from her mother. Both of her parents have passed away, and some of the family on her mother's side has passed away, so there is an inheritance in question. So I guess she goes to England to find out more about this inheritance that she possibly might get, and she has to learn to live like her British aristocratic family in order to gain this inheritance, which is where the My Fair Lady aspect comes into it. This is another book with a Victorian and Edwardian connection because it was published in 1909. It's called Gems from Tennyson, but Alfred Tennyson was a very famous poet in the Victorian era, decades before, and it doesn't actually have his poems in here. I really like Tennyson's Lady of Shalott. If you've never read it, it's the poem that Anne is reading at the very beginning of the Anne of Green Gables mini-series. It's just a book of quotations. It has some beautiful flowers on the side as the quotations. A lot of his poetry was about chivalry. The Lady of Shalott is about Camelot and Arthurian legend, so I like his poems for that reason. This book was originally published in 1864. It's called The Book of Golden Deeds. It has another really pretty cover. So as I was reading a little bit about this book, it sounds like it's filled with stories for children about bravery and self-sacrifice. I think my favorite thing about old books and reading old books is that it's the closest we will ever come to time travel. Even if things are sensationalized or the truth is kind of stretched about everyday life from something that was in the Victorian era 150 years ago or the Regency era, we are still getting a little bit of a glimpse as to what it might be like to live in that era. We're stepping inside someone else's mind who is seeing things from their unique era's point of view. There are things from our era that we are only going to see this way at this particular point in time. I've always wanted to time travel. I've always been fascinated by that. I knew so much about some of my great-grandparents, some of my great-great-grandparents, because those stories were really passed on in my family. The stories that my grandparents used to tell me were really alive for me. And so I love stepping back into these books and seeing that at the end of the day, good or bad, humans haven't really changed all that much. Our basic emotions are the same. I think you can get a lot of cool and fun ideas from another era, just like the 50 Social Evenings book that I showed you. You would probably be completely bored by the idea of a nutting party, but at the same time it might be kind of fun. Or even having people over to talk about their trips and to show us their souvenirs and to make like a fake itinerary and a little picnic that you have inside where you imagine that you're traveling to all these places by going to the different stations and hearing people's stories. I mean, that would be interesting. And I think it's kind of sad after looking through these books, so many of these are out of print. That's what I've loved about Victober and even watching the Victober vlogs, because I've been discovering new stories and new authors and people I wouldn't have thought about reading or even heard about until I've seen these vlogs. So actually, for me, myself, making this vlog, looking through these books has made me think about a lot of books that are out of print and that have been lost in time. And what's really cool, if you guys don't know about it, is Project Gutenberg, and you can get PDFs and ebooks and just HTML text of different books that have disappeared. Some of them are the classics, like you can definitely read Jane Austen and you can read the Brontes on there, but some of them are the books like these that you wouldn't find anyplace else, and someone has painstakingly copied and kept and preserved digital copies of these. It was so much fun looking through all of these books with you guys. I've been wanting to look through them for the longest time, and I thought it would be fun to share it with you. If you are just a book enthusiast or love vintage books, let me know your favorite vintage book if you have one, or your favorite old book that you've read. And until next time, I will see you real soon. Bye!